Okay, I'm back now, and as you can see, the lead is now starting to melt. That was about 8 minutes, I'd say, for the lead to start melting. And once it starts melting, then just make sure it's all melted down, so then you can, so everything's melted, you don't get any impurities that are coming into your jigs. And once that's all melted, just make sure you have your hook in the right jig mold. Make sure it's nice and straight in, so you don't have any space that the light could fall out from. Close it really tightly, and when you're holding these, make sure it's really tight so you don't have any space between. That space can basically have lead fall through it and burn just any of your surfaces. Okay, now we're going to pour them in. Wait for about 5 seconds for it to dry. You'll typically know when it dries when everything is really hard. See, that's really hard. It's a little hot, but really, it cools down really quickly. Make sure you have your light clippers to pull it off because it can be still very hot. And this is basically what it'll look like. See, this little top is just the light coming out. I always just clip that off with these. Clip it in. I use that spare lead. See, you have these little tags and stuff. All these little tags you can just basically file off. That's why we have our file. And when you have a little extra lead, you can always still, it all depends how many jigs I'm making, so I'll make another one, smaller size. Close it up then, make sure there's no space, and then pour another one. And see, this one poured a little bit unevenly because it went into another mold, and that really doesn't matter as long as it's not going everywhere. You just clip it off with your light clippers. See, we got now this one, different sizes. And if you have a little extra lead over time, maybe you can just put that in a mold and just use this spare lead. And typically, make sure you're not burning your lead over a long period of time, because eventually it'll start to not really evaporate, but it'll start to disappear over time, and it gets to extreme temperatures, so just make sure you're using up all your lead. So I'm just going to pour it into each mold just so I have that spare lead. Then once you're done with melting your lead, make sure you unplug the pot. Now, it takes a very long time for these pots typically to cool down, so just make sure you don't have any objects that could melt or burn. Make sure you're not anywhere close to touching it. So now we have our spare lead here that I just melted down. That's just the lead I had left, and we'll just use that as just a spare lead. So now we have our two jigs that I made different sizes, 1/4 and a 1/16. Well, yeah, 1/8. So now, to make these nice and smooth, we're basically just going to take our smaller file. And I would recommend getting a very fine, sort of fine grain here, just so it's a lot easier on the jigs and makes it look a lot better. So now we're just going to basically file it down just so it's nice and smooth. And sometimes it'll take, it shouldn't take you too long, especially if you have it really tight. But if you don't really have your mold really tight, typically it'll take a long time for you to file these down just so they're nice and smooth. And typically once you have these filed down, if you see sometimes these jigs on the very backs, sometimes the lead won't fill in. If that lead doesn't ever fill in, there's a little empty spot there, just use some paint, brush it around, and that'll basically have a seal, and that'll just close it in, and basically the jig just won't be able to fall off. That'll happen from time to time if you don't pour it in correctly. And when you're pouring in your jigs, make sure you're pouring it in really fast. If you're doing it really slow, the lead will basically will dry up, will start to cool down really quickly, and when that happens, it'll harden really quickly, and you just won't have a right jig. So I'll start filing this down. Make sure everything's nice and smooth. Clip off anything that's sharp or that's sticking out from the jig. And as you can see, that's a very smooth jig now. Now we got all the tags off. There's still a little bit of tags and everything, but sometimes you can deal with it and it'll still work well. So now what we're going to do is we can paint. Now you can paint. Do It makes these jig paints as well. Basically these are very cheap. Some of them can be from $5 to $6, but this paint, this basically dry on paint, is very nice. You can dip it on, brush it on, or spray paint it on. And there's another brand that's the dry stuff that burns, that you basically burn and it has a very hard coating. That type of stuff is very good, but it can be very expensive at times. So now we're gonna paint these a greenish color. You can get any color that you want at any your local store or Bass Pro. So, and remember, if you're in a ventilated room when you're with this paint, because this paint can have a very strong odor to it as well. And before you open it up, always make sure you shake it up just a little bit. And this paint can be very thick at times. That's why you can buy some Do It jig paint thinner. That stuff can make your paint a lot thinner so it goes on evenly. Once you're done shaking it, typically I like to just dip it on. We'll just dip it on until the whole thing's coated. Let it sit for 2 seconds and then pull it out. And once you pull it out, as you can see the paint's dripping out a little bit. Just make sure that drips out so you're not wasting any paint. Let it do it 2 or 3 times. And that's why it's always good to have a drying rack. Because when you have a drying rack, you can the paint will just drip on the rack and you won't have to worry about paint getting anywhere. So as you can see, it's still dripping a little bit. Sometimes I'll just let it dry on the rack. But make sure you let these little drops come off a lot, because after a while of drying, sometimes these drops can just dry and it makes your jig look really bad. But see, that's a good even coat. And basically, you can put as many coats on as you want. I would recommend putting at least 2 or 3 on. 2 or 3 makes it look really nice. It gives a real hard coating. And most of the time, these coats will not come off after a long period of time. So it takes about, I'd say, 30 to an hour. I'd say about an hour and 30 minutes for it to dry. I would let it dry a little bit longer than that, because after a while this coat will get really sticky. So just make sure it's really dry. Okay.